everybody. Welcome to season 4, episode 16 of A Conversation with Cometan. Today, I'm really excited to be doing the final interview of this season. It's going to be one that is very different from a lot of the other content that I normally produce. It's actually going to be with Dr. Joseph Shaw of the Latin Mass Society. The reason why I am quite invested and interested in traditionalist Catholicism is because my grandparents were actually quite instrumental in the traditionalist movement in the early 1970s. And I've been doing, for those of you who follow my work, you'll know that I've been doing quite a bit of research on my grandparents, Irene and Derrick Taylor, for the last couple of years. And I'm really just excited and interested to get Dr. Shaw's sort of perspective on the Tridentine Mass, the Latin Mass, and its current situation and its current status in the Catholic Church, but then also to kind of relate that back as well to some of the work that my grandparents were involved in. So this is sort of a kind of personal project for me, essentially, that I've been doing for the last couple of years. And this interview is just another way for me to kind of explore, get new ideas and information about this movement and the sort of legacy, really, that my grandparents helped to build. So without further ado, I do want to now begin the interview. I hope you guys like it. It is, very different from a lot of the Astronism content that I produce, but hopefully you guys can appreciate it, and hopefully you learn a little bit more about my own background as well, because my grandparents were very involved in my upbringing, and certainly their religiosity has inspired me in many ways, even though, we're part of two very different religions now. But I think I can still connect to their and relate to their religiosity in ways that that sort of allow me to connect back to them in a way, because they are both passed away. Anyway, I'll stop rambling now and I'll let you get into the video. So enjoy this interview, guys. First of all, thank you for joining me. I have been wanting to speak to someone who can sort of represent the community of sort of traditionalist Catholics really for quite a while. It's been a research area for me of interest. My grandparents, primarily because of my grandparents, they were very heavily involved in the very, very early years, in the very early 1970s, in this movement. And I suppose my first question, Dr. Shaw, is what is the current status, just to clarify it for people and for myself, what is the current status of the Tridentine Mass in the Catholic Church right now? Because we've received, that there's quite a lot of headlines, that go on about this, and the Pope's putting more restrictions on it. It's sort of reversing earlier, reversing earlier sort of loosening of restrictions. So just for myself, really, what is this?
Well, it is a confusing situation, and the best I can do is to say that it's excuse me, it's permitted, it's regulated,
right?
So it's permitted, but with under certain circumstances and with the permission of the local bishop, and it means that in practice, it's because it was less regulated until quite recently, until 2 years ago. It's actually fairly well, fairly freely available in the UK, in America, France. Less so in Italy, Spain, but it is there. I'm so sorry. The most recent regulations, though, have been aimed at trying to make it less widely available.
Yes.
And they are beginning to bite. But not that many people go to it. So, a very, very small percentage of Catholics go to it. But it has been growing.
Yes.
So if you want to go to it in London, for example, then you've got several different places you can go. It's also available in York, in Cardiff, Birmingham, so on and so forth.
Yes, yeah. So it is, I suppose, we are in a different situation now compared to when the sort of reforms were first introduced, perhaps in sort of the time period I've been looking at in the 1970s. From people I've spoken to, it was much less widely available at that time. It was much more scarce, really, and that's the sort of time period I've been looking at. But it is good just to get an update on its current status. Just again,
those were very dark days. Yeah, so it was available only in a kind of very, very kind of minor kind of odd locations and with kind of retired priests and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. And my grandparents' house was one of those odd locations. It's sort of in the countryside, done in secret. Some people was almost, done under the radar in a way. Very interesting time, and that's why I'm so interested in researching it. Again, just another aspect of this topic that is, I've read so much, and it is again so confusing, is why ultimately, and hopefully you can kind of give us maybe 3 or 4 or maybe 5 points, just to kind of outline what are the main theological concerns over those reforms, if you're able to answer that, and the reform to the liturgy, because there's been various different ideas put out that the Latin Mass is in some way sort of sacred, that the Tridentine Rite is in a way sort of immutable, that if you change that, then you're kind of changing the meaning of the Mass in a way. Just to sort of, again, dumb it down for myself.
Yeah, sure.
What are some of those main theological concerns?
That you mean from the traditional Catholic's point of view? So
yeah.
In other words, why do they cling to this Mass? Well, I think that a lot of the people who go to the traditional Mass and want to go to it, they wouldn't necessarily come out with a whole lot of theological objections to the Reformed Mass. Yeah. They just like the old Mass, and it fed their souls, and they go along to the new Mass, and it's rather different, and it's a bit it's not, they're not used to it, and it's kind of rebarbative.
Yes.
So, and I think that's a perfectly fair point. The Church is not authoritarian in as regards devotions. If you like the Rosary, you can pray the Rosary. If you like Little Office of the Blessed Virgin Mary, you can recite that. And actually you don't have to do either. And it's always been the case that there have been different schools of spirituality, different devotions, different pilgrimage places you can go to, and really it's whatever works for you.
Yes.
In fact, I very much like this kind of old saying, Catholic saying, pray as you can, not as you can't. Yeah. So someone recommends some sort of form of prayer, and you try it out, and it just doesn't work for you. Well, don't bang your head against a brick wall. Try something else.
Yes.
It's really that simple. So in that sort of spirit, it's quite difficult to understand why authorities of the Church, bishops, were saying to people, you've got to go to this new Mass, and we will not allow you to go to the other. And if your spiritual life is kind of wrecked by this change, well, that's just too bad.
Yeah.
And that's very odd. It seems un-Catholic, very un-Catholic to me. So people, were legitimately upset about that. Now, At the same time as the change in the Mass, there was a massive dissent against the traditional teachings of the Church. And they became associated in people's minds. And I don't think this association is accidental, but they are two separate phenomena which are connected in complex ways.
Yes.
Now, your grandparents, I think, were at the kind of the more radical end of the spectrum than my predecessors in the Latin Mass Society. So my predecessors were trying to get the Mass accepted by the bishops. So they were emphasising that we're just Orthodox Catholics. We're not saying the Pope has fallen into error or anything. Just let's have the Mass. Not everyone took such an emollient view, but I don't think anyone can point to a bit in the Novus Ordo text which is actually heretical. Yeah. So the typical argument is that it leaves things out. Yeah. And it certainly does leave things out. Yeah. So it leaves out. So if you compare the text side by side, which is actually more complicated than it sounds, because the Novus Ordo is such a different beast, there's so many options and stuff. Yeah. But insofar as you can compare them side by side, you find that a lot of the language of sacrifice, for example, is missing. It's just gone. It's gone AWOL in the Reform. It's there on the cutting room floor, as they say in the film industry. And same is true of the invocation of the saints, the need we have for grace, the fact that the world is a potentially hostile environment, anything to do with penance, right? And sin and God's judgment, any references to damnation. And it goes on and on and on. Now, this is not paranoia. Your grandparents weren't paranoid. This has now been established by very, very careful research. But the research has taken decades because, as I say, it's so complicated. Yeah. So this research has now been done in great, great detail. And it's perfectly obvious. And the other thing that's happened gradually over the decades, which wasn't, it was, people could see it instinctively straight away, but we now have the documentation, is that the people involved have been publishing their memoirs, sometimes posthumously. Yes. So you can look at people who are involved in the Reform. What exactly did they think they were doing? So we've got a much clearer picture now than before. And yeah, they were quite clear about it. They said, yes, we're getting rid of these things because we think they're negative, that we think they're off-putting, we think they're unsuited to modern people. Yeah. Now, I personally don't want to start saying that they're in league with the devil or anything. I think they were sincere. Yeah. But there is a theological disagreement at the bottom of what's going on. Yes. To reiterate, the theological disagreement is there, but the way it's manifested in the liturgical text is somewhat complicated because they didn't put in, oh, I don't believe in hell, I don't believe in the devil. I think, there's far too much talk about the saints. They didn't say that in the text, or they simply removed references. And they didn't remove every single one. No. They removed maybe 80% or 90%, and that makes a huge difference to one's experience. But as I say to people, well, the old prayers, some of them, the canon, for example, the canon of the Mass, it's there. It's an option. It's not very much used, but it is there. And that has all this stuff about sacrifice. And you can't say the Novus Ordo Missal, the whole collection of texts, denies that the Mass is a sacrifice, because this is there. Okay, it's not much used, but it's there. As a whole thing. It doesn't deny it. So it's a much more subtle thing. So the other thing that I would say is that the other way in which it's connected to theological dissent, what was going on in the late 60s was a huge debate about contraception. Yeah. So it was the sexual revolution. Everyone was getting very excited about it, and they were kind of inventing the pill, and it was just kicking off. So Pope Paul VI, he, as we all know, he appointed a commission to theologians to give him advice, and he cooked up his encyclical Humanae Vitae, and he reiterated the traditional teaching of the Church as he understood it, which was an absolute no to artificial contraception, to the pill, to condoms, all that stuff. And this went down incredibly badly with the people who've been trying to change. So we call them the liberals, or the dissenters, because they disagree with him. They rejected his teaching. So there's this a mighty battle going on, and that was just before the new mass came out.
Yes,
like 12 months before. So everything was happening at once, and so one argument which I've heard, which I like a lot, which I think makes sense to me, is that one thing that needs to be explained is this: that not every single one of them, but the great majority of theological liberals tend to align themselves with liturgical liberals.
Right.
So why is that? Is it just a coincidence? Is it just because they change one thing, change everything? Well, one argument is that if you change the ancient liturgy, this liturgy that's been the same for all these centuries, and going back back to almost exactly the same in the 30th century, substantially the same the 4th century, and we just don't know what happened before that. The records aren't exist. Yeah. So if you not only change it but also trash the older version, if you go around saying it was actually a lot of mumbo jumbo, and that people were wrongfully excluded, and ordinary Catholics had no real share in the Mass, and all this sort of thing, which is what people were saying, the theological kind of radicals. Actually, it makes the argument about contraception much easier to make, because the Church is wrong about the liturgy. The Church can be wrong about anything. That's it. Yeah, and that's not strictly logical, but as a psychological thing, I think it's very powerful. The liturgy is the most intimate part of the Church's life. It's where we pray in the most solemn way. It's the most solemn key part of our spiritual lives. The Church was wrong about that for all these centuries. Radically wrong, according to these people. So wrong that she was oppressive and kind of bad and kind of excluding people and all this stuff that they say. Then the Church cannot be trusted about anything.
Yes.
Actually, that destroys the prestige of the Church's tradition in a wide sense: theological, liturgical, spiritual, and in every way. So it's a catastrophe, I think, for a theological conservative, that the liturgy changed at that moment. So in the 60s, the people didn't wait until 1969 when the Novus Ordo was published. There was already changes which were being made, and there was a kind of lot of experimentation going on. And there was a tax on the Mass. So priests saying, "Oh, I can now say it in English or their own native language," in 1964, and they were saying, "Wasn't it ridiculous that we had it in Latin?" It's not, "Oh, well, we have this option now, and we'll go on saying it in Latin sometimes, for solemn occasions." No. They were saying it was ridiculous, and you were made fools of, and people were completely kind of thrown off by this. I mean, what's going on? You were saying last week that it was very important to have it in Latin, and all these arguments have been developed because people have talked about it. Of course, all these arguments were developed about how it was going to unify the Church, kept us in connection with our ancestors, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, suddenly you've changed your mind. It's just weird. So what's going to happen next?
Yes, yeah, and all of this is definitely related to things that I've been thinking about, particularly regarding my grandparents, but also the broader movement as well. When I read some of the writings and interviews that they did, certainly that idea about if you can change the liturgy, then I think particularly my grandfather, because he was a convert, I think
Oh yes.
so something that it put him in a very unique position. I think when the liturgy changed, he sort of began to doubt other distinct Catholic doctrines like confession, for example, because he really brought up with, he was an Anglican, so I think it made him look at other parts of the Catholic faith, and I think again it was just a very dark time for him in particular, I think. But
it's interesting about converts in particular. A lot of the early activists for the traditional mass were converts.
Yes.
People already noticed it at the time.
Yeah.
I thought this is extraordinary. All these converts are kind of lining up, and the cradle Catholics are just sort of like, well, we just do whatever the priest says, And the converts say, well, no, we had to argue our way into. We had to disobey the people who brought us up. Our own, priests, ministers, whoever they were, teachers. We had to think for ourselves, say no to them, and engage in this rather weird, but we thought wonderful Catholic tradition. And we had to kind of get our heads around this different way of participating in the liturgy, because most have been Anglicans. And they were used to making responses and hearing it in English, and of course the Anglican liturgy can be rather lovely. It's beautiful English, for example, and then suddenly introduced this English, which, well, one of them called it, Alec Guinness called it supermarket English. Oh. So you imagine, you're an Anglican, you're going to the Book of Common Prayer. And you say, no, this isn't solemn enough. I want to go to the Catholic thing, and it's in Latin, and it's kind of incense. It's amazing thing. Gosh, this is going to take a bit used to, but here it is. It's very, very dignified and reverent and stuff. And I really get into that. And then suddenly they turn it into something which is much, much less reverent than the Anglican thing that you left behind, 10, 20, 30 years previously. And I can hardly imagine what they must have felt. Awful experience for them. So some of the really, really prominent people, not only in England, actually, although England, of course, was a lot of converts in those days in England, but also in Germany, there were two very important German leaders of the traditional mass, both of whom were converts. Erich von Savanthen, who was the president of University International, the federation all over the world, and a philosopher called Dietrich von Hildebrand. So very, very interesting characters. Bernini, who was in charge of the reform, he actually wrote in his book, "Oh yeah, it's these converts who are the problem."
Do you think that this is quite interesting? Do you think that that in a way the church was quite surprised that there was this backlash from sort of ordinary people, really?
Yes.
And that's something that I got from speaking to Father Peter Morgan, who I spoke to here. And it was just fascinating to speak to him. He's now in his 80s, but he remembers that time very vividly.
Yes.
And he said that he felt that the church was quite taken aback when these ordinary people, working class like my grandparents, kind of stood up in sort of response. Do you think that the church, in a way, was kind of expecting people just to go along with this and not to kind of challenge it? Business as usual, in a sense?
Absolutely. I think for two reasons. One is that they had this culture of obedience.
Yes.
They told people to do things, and people did them. Fasting, for example, going to a church and so on. And the other thing was Paul VI. I think, for all his faults, I think he was quite a sensitive man. Aesthetically sensitive, spiritually sensitive. And he he gave these allocutions, these talks to the general audience, or happens on a Wednesday evening, two Wednesdays running immediately before the Noah's Order came out. And he said, it will be a sacrifice for us.
Right.
It will be a sacrifice to those of us who know the expressive sacrality of the Latin language. Now, of course, he had an elite education.
Yes.
His Latin, I'm sure, was extremely good.
Yeah.
And he knew other people who'd had a similar education who also had kind of amazing Latin. So they would have looked at these ancient prayers and the Latin texts, and they would have kind of heard the kind of the cadences of the poetry, and it would have brought to mind the kind of the references which were embedded in the text to the Psalms and to the Gospels, and kind of, they would have had this kind of very interesting aesthetic experience from that. But equally, he knew very well that the ordinary kind of ordinary Catholic does not have that education, and he's not having that kind of experience. So he said, we're making this, we the educational elite, the spiritual elite of the church, we're making this sacrifice for the sake of, and the phrase he used was men of affairs and labor.
Right.
Men of affairs, men of labor, men of affairs. So what he meant was basically ordinary people. I mean, working class people, middle class people, everyone except the very, very kind of, elevated people who'd spent 20 years studying Latin.
Yeah.
And it must have been a bit of a shock for him to discover that it was the ordinary people, French peasants, Italian industrial workers, children,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and people like your grandparents who were actually demonstrated a hugely strong attachment to the traditional mass. And again, this was noticed. Everyone realised this, that they actually made a mistake. That Brian Howden, have you come across his writings?
No, I've not.
I do recommend him very much for your research, because he's died in 1992. But he's a great champion of the laity. So his autobiography has now been found and republished, having not been available for years. And he wrote 2 novels, Judith's Marriage and Mitre and Crook. Anyway, one of the things he said, I think in a preface to one of the novels, was it's the people who didn't know Latin who are most annoyed about it being taken away. And that's a sort of paradox. Obviously, it's a paradox, but it's not incomprehensible if you really think about it. Because the Latin had enabled them to engage with the liturgy in a mystical way.
Yes.
In a very profound way, in a way it's too deep for words.
Yes.
So Houghton said, look at these ordinary people, not very educated, but fervent. And they were engaging in, to use a technical term, supernatural prayer.
Yes.
Now, to engage in supernatural prayer is well, it requires all sorts of things. It requires a virtue of life, which you don't necessarily have if you're a great theologian. You don't gain it from having a kind of, a higher degree in Latin language. It's a different thing altogether, on a kind of different level altogether. But also, you need to be kind of have an experience, a liturgical experience, which kind of puts you in the right frame of mind.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is something which another author of that era said, Louis Boyer, another convert. The convert, Houghton was also a convert. So all these converts who go and see what the people on the inside couldn't really articulate. Louis Boyer said that this is what the liturgy is for. It's to put the faithful in a certain frame of mind, a certain kind of spiritual place, that it would be pointless to try to recreate with propositions.
Yes.
You could say all the kind of theology, that you wanted for hours and hours on end, and it wouldn't put you in that place. And actually, I think it's once you experience it like that, it's fairly clear, it's fairly obvious, and it's not unprecedented. We all kind of know this. I mean, that on a spiritual level, that is kind of unique, but there are parallels. Just thinking about listening to pop music, it puts you emotionally into a certain place, or a family occasion, or a football match, or all the things that kind of mean something to you in a profound way. It's not about words. It's words are necessary, of course. But what's so clever about the Mass is that you've got these amazing words. I mean, really, really rich theologically, references to the scripture, beautiful poetry, and the words just form they kind of create the scene for something really profound, which is going on between the individual worshipper and Christ. And if you're kind of amazing intellectual and you've got all this Latin and stuff, then you can appreciate it perhaps at both levels. But I think the terrible mistake, which was an honest mistake, is that these guys like Paul VI, who did understand it, he thought that these ordinary Catholics could not access it in a spiritually productive way, and it's a terrible. He just hadn't. Because one of the famous things about Paul VI and so many popes is that he never ever had pastoral work. He had never worked with ordinary Catholics. He never actually baptized people's babies, instructed them in marriage, dealt with their problems, talked to them, understood them, lived among them. Very few popes, because they're such high flyers. They the people end up popes, such high flyers that they just zoom cred over the heads of everyone else. Even today, a lot of bishops are appointed who spend a very short time in pastoral ministry, if at all. Bishop secretary, head of a seminary somewhere, desk job, and then bishop. Well, the great counterexample to that is Pius X. He was a parish priest for 9 years, bishop for 9 years. So you could see the kind of the lack of insight into the ordinary Catholic life that a lot of these people had who were involved in the reform.
Yeah, definitely, and also I think again, just coming from the perspective of my grandparents that I've been doing research on, I think they felt in a way that, I mean, now people looking back may call them radicals perhaps, but I think they simply just thought that they were just continuing with their faith. They didn't see themselves, of course, as being radical. They were just continuing with what they'd always done. And I think that's quite interesting, but also as well, I think they felt they're in this tug of war, really. They wanted to remain loyal to the Pope, but then they also had Archbishop Lefebvre on that side, who they did converse with up to a point, but towards sort of the 1980s, they kind of diverged from him. Really, I think they felt he was going too far. Right. And some people may agree with that, may not. But again, I think it was just they didn't really know where to go, and I don't think. And again, just from reading their writings, they did kind of, in a way, prophesy that this would be, I don't know, detrimental to the church somehow. And I just wanted to talk from our position now, sort of 50 years later.
Yes.
And looking at sort of the way the church is now and the church attendance, but also Catholicity, as an experience. Do you think it has hurt? Do you think it has sort of been a factor in maybe declining church attendance, perhaps, or is that placing too much sort of emphasis on these reforms? Are there other factors involved, do you think, or?
Yes, well, there are certainly other factors involved.
Yeah.
I mean, every kind of membership organization has seen a decline since the 1970s. So, I mean, I like to make the comparison with the Freemasons. At one point, I found statistics online from the American Freemasons, and the graph is exactly the same curve as the Roman Catholic Church. So, I mean, so it's not just one kind.
Yeah.
So. But I think that doesn't mean that there was nothing that made any difference that the church did.
Yes.
And I think it really repays study to think about, well, what were the factors? Why did everyone have this problem? Well, there was the things that caused this problem were things which were undermining all sorts of communities. So people didn't go to their local clubs, people didn't do dinner parties, people didn't talk over the garden fence to their neighbors, because things like television, people spending a lot of time commuting in their new cars, which appeared in the 60s and 70s. People having university degrees in much greater numbers than before, experiencing completely different kind of friendship groups and all that sort of thing. So there's a whole lot of things that happened at the same time. And then, of course, you have the sexual revolution. Yes. Which undermined communities which were based on geographical areas, and also faith. Yeah. Now, so the question then is, well, if you're the church in that situation, or any organization, what do you do to counteract this? So what happened was that churchmen, they kind of knew what was going on. They could everyone was talking about it. So you ask a young Catholic in 1965 or 1975, well, what do you think about the church? And they're chafing against all these obligations. Oh, it's such a bore having to fast. Oh, we can't be bothered to go to church on Sundays and all these holy days. And, oh, what a bore the Latin Mass is, because it's, and they come out with some objection. The obvious objection is that it's in Latin. I can't understand it. And these churchmen say, oh gosh, what are we going to do? We're going to lose them. Yeah. So, all right, quickly, get rid of fasting on Fridays. Yeah. Get rid of Friday absence from meat. Make it, cut down the number of holy days. Cut this, do that. Make it less different from the rest of society, so that it's less embarrassing to them. Yeah. Get rid of all those embarrassing plaster statues. And now they thought they were in a negotiation with this younger generation, but they were wrong. Yeah. The younger generation was simply and very naturally feeling the pull, the attraction of things of the non-Catholic society, their university friends, the ideas they saw on TV, the things that they encountered when they moved house, and gone to work in London, all those sorts of things. So they were feeling that attraction, and they were losing contact with their communities, their local Catholic communities, which were being less and less influential over them. Yeah. So you go out and you want to kind of reassure yourself about something you've experienced, you've had, or some idea you've read about. And who do you talk to? Well, you might be talking to your university friends, you might be talking to your parents, chums, you might be talking to your school friends, talk to the people in the parish. Now, what they're doing, they're being drawn more and more away from their fellow Catholics, who could kind of reassure them and say, yeah, we've heard that too, but isn't it nonsense because we're Catholics and we believe this? Yeah. Isn't it nonsense about this idea that you don't need to get married to, start shacking up with someone, or isn't it nonsense? And that's what their Catholic friends might have said. Yeah. But so what the bishops were doing, and the people in Rome and all the kind of progressive people think, well, they were making a concession to these young people, but actually the effect of what they did was to cut further the ties with the community. Yes. Yeah. Now, the liturgy in the Mass is the most distinctive thing for those guys in the 50s, 60s, most distinctive thing about being a Catholic. You went to this strange mass, it was all in Latin, and your non-Catholic friends would say, oh, it's all mumbo jumbo. And you kind of go there and you have this extraordinary experience which you can't put into words. But it is difficult to defend, to these people who are just, modern, rational kind of people. So, but it's what makes you a Catholic.
Yes. Yeah.
And so they said, oh gosh, we must make things easier for people. We'll have it all in English, and it'll be all just like, really boring English as well. We're not having these and thous. It's going to be all modern and streamlined and quick and undemanding. The Mass was a key marker of identity for Catholics.
Yes.
And you could like it or you could lump it, but that was a sociological fact.
Yeah.
You take it away and you weaken that community. Now, that community has been weakened, as I've already mentioned, by all kinds of things the church could not control. Yeah. Slum clearance, university education, television, car ownership, post-war migration, war experience itself, all the things coming out of the Second World War and indeed longer term trends. But they made it worse.
Yes. Yeah.
They pushed the process further and faster. The church was going down this slope and they pulled off the brakes.
Yeah.
And oh my word, they must have been, looking with hindsight, they must have been mad. I'm trying to explain how it is they came to do that. But it was a terrible, it was an honest mistake. It was a terrible, terrible mistake. And I don't think that you can deny that if you're intellectually honest and you look at the sociological stuff. So, one person who's done all this, who's a Catholic and has applied it, specifically to the church's situation, is Professor Stephen Bullivant.
Yes.
I recommend, listeners, don't believe me, believe a real sociologist of religion. He's actually got a chair of sociology of religion in St Mary's University, and he's written a great big book about it, and it's called Mass Exodus. Punning title. Anyway, it's all there. It's all there. All the kind of complicated, yes, different factors, everything taken into account. There's another book, actually, even more recent, by a French sociologist called Pouchet, which is very similar. And so it goes on. This is. I'm afraid the debate on this, no one is now saying. No serious person is now saying, oh, thank goodness the church made this change, because otherwise it would have been worse. That is just an unfortunate misunderstanding of the nature of the processes. And actually, I've heard people say that, of course, over the years. Oh, the church would have. I've never heard them actually go into detail. How is this supposed to work sociologically?
Yes.
And they say, oh, well, everyone was having this. Yes, of course they were. Of course they were. And look at the people who survived. The people those religious communities which weathered the storm. Who are they? Islam.
Yes.
Orthodox Christianity. The Amish.
Yes. Yeah.
The Mormons.
Yeah.
Those are the ones who've survived best. Now, there are some people who've done even less well than the Catholics. Who are they? Well, what they call in America mainline Protestants, Anglicans. Absolute catastrophe. Now, all the people who say, oh, if only the church had changed more, to keep the times. Well, look at the Anglicans. They did exactly what you wanted the Catholic Church to do, and they fared even worse than we have.
Yes, and that's taking place now, though, isn't it? This is ongoing.
Yes, it is.
The whole people, same-sex marriage, and all these kind of things that are coming up.
Yeah.
To the Pope, these kind of things, and I think, well, does the church really know what to do in a way? Does it know what path to really take? I spoke to a priest not long ago who said that the future of the Catholic Church is going to be that it's it's smaller essentially. It's going to be a much more condensed grouping of people. It's not going to be this sort of worldwide community in a sense, which I don't know. I thought that was quite a sort of odd way of looking at it, but that was his view, that the church is going to be smaller. We're going to have to accept this condensing down of the Catholic community. Yeah,
it's interesting. There's you often hear it. This idea the church is going to be smaller, and well, for one thing, it's kind of undeniable. It's already smaller. I mean, it's about half the size that it was 40 years ago. So, well, you know, there you are. But people kind of making it into a kind of virtue. The church is going to be, and it's going to be smaller. It's going to be great because it's going to be intense, and all the people are going to be really strong believers. I'm sorry, that's not true. The church, every year, a certain group of people leave the church. You know, let's say that are people who are closest to leaving the church, are the people who are weakest in their faith, people who are least well connected.
Yes.
And then every year, another group of people find themselves in that exact same position, and they leave the church. And it happens year after year. Why? Because the things which are binding us together as a community are progressively weakening. So it's just one rolls over, they all roll over and one falls out. So it's not that, half the churches, you know, half the Catholics of 50 years ago stopped practicing. So we must be, you know, the better half. Well, okay, in a way we are, I suppose. But that doesn't mean we're better than they were 50 years ago. It means we haven't yet got to the point. So the people who are teetering on the edge now were fervent then.
Yes.
The people who are fervent now are going to be teetering in 10 or 20 or 30 years time from now. So it's this idea that you have this sort of smaller hardcore. I'm sorry, it's a comforting fantasy.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say the church is going to kind of disappear in a linear way, because that isn't how things work. I mean, it's going to tail off.
Yes.
And you're going to be, well, there'll be someone left. Just as there are kind of, if you really, really search, there are sort of people who are still members of the United Reformed Church.
Yes.
It's kind of collapsed, but, you know, it still kind of exists. So just on a much lower level. And is that going to be wonderful? No. Is it wonderful? No. No, because they don't believe anything.
No.
You know, they've got, I mean, it has come completely liberal.
Yes.
And it's kind of meaningless. Well, I don't want to be rude to them specifically. I mean, that's a general thing about these kind of small non-conformist things. I mean, there are very strong ones, you know, you can find like in Scotland and stuff, independent churches. But a lot of them, they just become more and more liberal, and it's just kind of collapsed like a souffle. So the other thing I think about this kind of phrasing, and I know that Pope Benedict, you know, before he was Pope, he uses kind of language as well, because he had been very much part of the program. He'd been a Vatican II, you know, expert, and you know, all that stuff. So I don't agree with him when he says this. And I know a lot of traditional Catholics sort of, he said it must be true. No, it's because what he meant was that the church would be characterized by the kind of the really fervent people and stuff. And I think this is part of an attitude which was that the ordinary Catholics of 50 and 100 years ago were not real Catholics.
Right.
They weren't real believers. They kind of went along out of habit.
Right.
And losing them is no big loss.
Right.
And I think that is, for one thing, it's hideously patronizing. And it shows a kind of total lack of insight into what those people are like. And it's just disastrously wrong. And there's this is something that Brian Cometan says, that, you know, that the people behind the reform, they think that the ordinary Catholic worships out of habit, that his spirituality is totem worship, and that the gospel hasn't really changed his daily life. And he says it's totally unjust. But that was a view. And I think that they would have been quite happy to see the church lose all its working class adherents.
Right. Yes.
And they wouldn't have put it like that. They would have been horrified to hear it put like that. But actually, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Those ordinary Catholics, not highly educated, fervent, with a devotion to the Sacred Heart.
Yeah.
People who would kind of go on a walking pilgrimage and kind of really kind of get something out of that physical hardship and something which they feel they can sacrifice. They're not intellectuals. They haven't got a theology degree. They don't. It's not all about words. It's all about kind of saying the right things in a kind of touchy-feely kind of mass round in a circle around a table and taking it in turns to do the beginning prayers. They hated that kind of thing when they tried to impose it on them. They left in droves, and that does not make them bad Catholics. No. That does not show that they were bad Catholics. They were better Catholics, many of those guys, better ones than the theologians.
Yes.
And that is the tragedy, because actually those people, they were the backbone of the church.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's a particularly, this is particularly stark in England, because in the 60s, less so now, for good and bad reasons, but in the 60s, before, the church was slightly hourglass shaped.
Right.
We didn't have much of a Catholic middle class.
Right.
A lot of Catholic workers, some of them, many of them, Irish immigrants, of course. And you had this kind of Catholic aristocracy.
Yes.
That was kind of left over from, Elizabethan times. And you had Catholic intellectual converts, people like Newman and stuff, who were kind of amazing, and they kind of joined the kind of, intellectual elite. But there was not much in the middle.
Yes.
So it's kind of odd situation. So, and even now, actually, there's a kind of massive shortage of Catholic teachers. Very interesting, I think. Why is there so few Catholic teachers? Well, one reason is that there's this kind of gap in the middle of the kind of Catholic kind of socio-economic stack.
Wow.
But to say, let's do without those, people at the bottom of the pile. For England, that was a particularly stupid thing to say. You might have got away with it in France a bit more. But, actually that's true of all Catholic societies. Right. It's you need all of them.
Yes.
You need every level.
Yes.
And it's the people at the bottom have a particular vocation to express the nature of Catholic identity in their own way.
Yes.
In a way which I think that people at higher up can find a bit embarrassing, but it's important and it's necessary. If you don't have them, you've got a real problem.
Yeah, this is all really it's really interesting for me, because it's just taking me back to my own childhood, really, and how the local parish priest, I think, thought that my grandparents were just quite odd, and my grandparents, they had statues everywhere, in the gardens, in the house. It was like a shrine itself, and I think that
yeah.
They were really quite isolated, I have to say, by not only the priests, but also the rest of the Catholic community. So this is all really interesting for me to kind of hear this. That's why I've used them as a case study, because I think it's fascinating that there's this. I don't know this. I don't know, this divide in a way, or
Well, of course. Half of those statues, I wouldn't be surprised, they picked up out of skips. They're being chucked out of the church, and they want to give them a home.
That's right. Yes,
it's very characteristic now of traditional Catholic houses you go into. Particularly 20 years ago, but even today, that statues everywhere. And it's partly it's like an orphanage, orphanage for statues.
That's what it was like. Honestly. My granny would sort of go around to the different churches that were closing down, or etc. Come on, I'll have all these paintings and statues and etc. And
same with vestments.
Yeah, and I just wonder from their perspective, what did they what did they think was taking place? You know, I think they were trying to keep it alive. Something they were trying to keep it alive, and I've spoken to other Catholics about this. They, you know, that maybe they thought their faith was dying in a way, and they tried to do everything they could in their own home. You know, their sanctuary. You know, no one could sort of come in and take these things away, and I don't know that the Catholicism seemed to retreat to the home in a way. In home anyway. And that's in that sense, it wasn't done in the church. It seemed to be more about the home in a sense. It was very odd, very, very strange. I don't know.
I mean, that's what you've got left.
Yeah.
If you lose the church, the physical churches, that's what you've got left. And it's like in recusant times.
Yeah.
You know, the Anglican, you know, the Protestants have taken over your parish church.
Yeah.
They've chucked out the statues, maybe burned them.
Yeah.
And you have a visiting priest in your home.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that happened a lot then. I mean, it's an extraordinary thought that we might be moving back into that situation again now.
Yeah, it is. I did want to just because I don't want to take too much of your time, but I just wanted to ask as well just about the sort of current situation again.
Yes.
Why do you think because of course, correct me if I'm wrong, Pope John Paul II relaxed some of these restrictions and he, in his wisdom, maybe saw things weren't going very well, and Benedict kind of continued with that. But then with Francis now, we're seeing a reversal of those things. So why? What is going on, do you think, in this contemporary time regarding the Latin Tridentine Rite? Do you think?
Well, it's very confusing. Very strange. So Pope Paul VI let us have the Mass in England with the bishop's permission. That was in 1971. So that was before it even been outlawed the first time around. So that was unique around the world, but it was because there was a particular big pushback from these English converts and stuff, and that was, I think, no doubt he thought that would just be a thing for a time and that we'd all die out. We didn't die out.
Yeah.
So in 1984, John Paul II, he made that English experience for the whole world.
You're right.
It's called an indulta permission. It's kind of against the law, but we're giving you permission to do this with the bishop's permission. And then in 1988, he reiterated that. But most of the bishops were very reluctant to give this permission. So often in many places, it was a dead letter. However, it did happen in some places. But in 1988, he did something else as well, which is he allowed, he'd had these negotiations with Lefebvre, which has failed in the end. But some of Lefebvre's priestly supporters, they wanted to accept the deal, which Lefebvre had in the end not accepted. So they said to the Pope, well, can we be within the church like Lefebvre would have been if he had signed this letter? And he said, yes, that'd be great. So they set up called the Fraternity of St. Peter.
Yes. Yeah.
And there were other groups like that. So they were a religious order, an institute of priests within the church, under the bishops, and they under the authority, with the authorization of the Pope, they could go into diocese with the permission of the bishop and celebrate the Mass. They didn't need extra permissions every time they celebrated an extra Mass, and their whole lives were on this Mass. Yeah. So that's what they all did. They never celebrated their Ordo. Now, that gradually began to make a difference. So they gradually grew. Now they're quite big. I mean, not massive, but, hundreds of priests rather than just tens.
Yes.
So we now have a situation in which, so then in 2007, Pope Benedict said, right, no priest needs permission of the bishop. Now there's still a certain conflict, still people not wanting it, refusing to give it to you, chucking out of your church, all that sort of stuff. But it was a fight going on, but it was much, much freer. And people felt for the first time, what I call conservative Catholics who were just basically Orthodox, wanted to do what the Pope wanted, they finally felt that this actually had the official stamp of approval.
Yes.
And so that a whole lot of people who've been holding back, who was, oh no, I don't want to do that. The Pope doesn't really like it. He's allowing it for these odd people as a kind of act of charity. Now the Pope's saying, no, it's not an act of charity. It's for the good of the whole church, because this Mass is a treasure which should be respected, should be preserved for the life of the church. People say, oh, okay, well, perhaps I'll try it after all. So it really started growing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still tiny. It's still tiny. So I know that people felt, this was kind of threatening and frightening and stuff. But it is a bit odd. If it's a threat, it's a very long-term threat. So I think there's a certain amount of paranoia among the liberals, the people who don't like it. But I think it's symbolic for them. It represents for them the overturning of everything which they've given their lives to, which is the kind of the new church they want to create, where we don't believe in anything and we don't wear any vestments and we don't kind of, it's just, whatever it is they want, whatever their vision is. So it's a kind of rejection of that. And they're not totally wrong about that. I mean, there is a kind of, obviously there's a tension there. So Pope Francis is elected. And I think it's important to remember that for 8 years of his pontificate, which is actually not, he could easily have died and we would have thought, oh, he's done nothing about the traditional Mass, because he didn't do it, he didn't touch it.
Yeah.
People asked him, are you going to clamp down on it? Because he obviously wasn't a kind of person like Benedict, very different personality, very different theological vision. But he said, no, I'll just leave it alone.
Yes.
I don't want to kind of poke the hornet's nest.
Yes.
And then finally, in year 8, he said, okay, I'm going to pick it. Now, why? What had happened? And to be absolutely frank, I don't know exactly. And to be even more frank, nobody knows, really. I went to Rome. I mean, I go to Rome, as part of this work regularly, and I spoke to everyone. I asked them all the same question. Shortly after it came out in October, after the July publication, I said to them, who is a target? Someone's annoyed the Pope. Pope wants to squash someone back into his box. Who is this person? Because I don't think it's necessarily me personally. Is it the fraternities of these priests that were authorized by Pope John Paul II? Is it diocesan clergy started celebrating the Mass thanks to Pope Benedict? Is it lay people? Is it annoying lay people who've got YouTube channels?
Yeah.
I don't mean you, Brandon. I mean, other people who are kind of, got these massive followings and getting massive money and all the rest of it, and coming up with these inflammatory things.
Yeah.
And so who is it? Who's annoyed the Pope? Why are we all suffering? And no, they all had something to say, but they all had something different to say. In fact, if you ask 5 people, you get 6 explanations. Now, what I thought when I went out there, was you think, if the government has a new policy and you want to find out about it, and you're a journalist, or a researcher, and you go to the government and you have a, informal conversation with a junior minister or a civil servant or a well-connected journalist or a member of the diplomatic corps who's got an interest in this particular issue, or, observers, what you'll get is a kind of semi-official kind of narrative.
Right.
Which will be consistent, because the people who instituted the new policy, they want people to know, sort of secret. And even if it's slightly embarrassing, it'll kind of leak out in a consistent way, because there'll be some explanation and people will talk to each other and it'll just kind of descend down the kind of vine until it gets to the people that even quite an ordinary person like me could go and talk to. Well, it wasn't like that at all. All the people I spoke to, they looked at this document with kind of puzzlement, and they had applied their perhaps considerable experience and understanding and knowledge to understanding why it had happened, simply by looking at the document. They had not heard it from some senior person who really knew the backstory.
Right.
And that's why they all came to different conclusions.
Yes.
Because there was no steady stream of consistent, this is why it's happened,
Yes.
coming from the top. So, and this is quite characteristic of Pope Francis' way of governing the church. So he doesn't set a kind of clear policy. He's an enigma.
Yeah.
And under him, this person's trying to do this, and this person's trying to do that, and this person falls out with him, and it's not quite clear why. He might favor this person, he might favor that person, and then suddenly this, something else happens, and he reverses policies, and he promotes this idea, and then it doesn't go down very well, and it wasn't my idea. But this is an extreme example even of that.
Yes, it is.
So for 8 years, he was saying, "Oh, leave them alone. These trads. They may be a bit cracked, maybe a bit funny in the upper story." He was quite rude about us.
Yeah, that's right.
But nevertheless, they're harmless, basically harmless. And suddenly, we're not harmless at all. We're kind of like, I don't know what,
threat or something. So
microbes.
I don't know, of some kind.
Well, so among the different ideas is, someone showed him a video of some kind of raving kind of, person who probably is a sedevacantist and doesn't believe the Pope's the Pope, and that's one possibility, or maybe that's part of the explanation. But I think a lot of it is to do with another part of it is to do with curial politics.
Yes.
Curial politics of a kind that I don't really understand. And to be honest, I don't particularly want to understand. I do anything to understand this. But generally speaking, I don't want to understand it. It's all about, this cardinal who's trying to get votes in the next conclave, who thinks that he can do that by appealing to this constituency in this particular country. And this other cardinal who thinks, oh yes, well, since that cardinal's doing that, I need to do the opposite in order to get and it's not very ideological.
Yes.
And I think it's a mistake that a lot of commentators make, Catholic and non-Catholic, is to assume that every battle in the church is a battle about theology. Actually, I think there's a lot of opportunistic maneuvering going on. And of course, they can all give it a theological kind of overcoat.
Yes, yeah.
They've all got theological training.
Yes.
They think in theological terms because they're churchmen. But that doesn't mean that the underlying, impetus is theology for them. So,
right.
I think that one story I've heard is a lot of Italian bishops didn't like it. They were threatened by it. They could see that the only priestly vocations in the church in Italy were going to traditional groups,
right?
And it really drove them up the wall. And they thought, well, let's just get rid of it.
Yes.
And that's not really a view that's shared outside Italy, even by bishops.
Yes.
So nevertheless, the Italian is, Italy is the kind of tail that wags the dog to some extent in the church. And that's just one theory. Just one theory. Another theory is that it's Americans, they're to blame.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And it's these annoying Americans with their podcasts or their YouTube, or it's the American priests,
yes,
who are kind of irritating their bishops, maybe irritating their flocks. Certainly, whenever a traditional mass appears, there are some people in the clergy, in the laity, who, as I mentioned just earlier, they think this contradicts everything I've worked for.
Yes.
I don't need to go to it. I'm not offended by it personally. It doesn't impinge on my spiritual life. But I just hate the fact that it's happening in this church.
Yes.
And so you get this odd phenomenon of a priest puts on an extra mass, and it's traditional mass, and it's kind of Sunday evening.
Yeah.
And there's never been a mass on a Sunday evening, but now there is, and collects a little congregation, and it's the people who go on the Sunday morning or the Saturday evening who are really kind of, "Oh, I don't like this." Oh, well, what skin on is it? What skin off your nose is this? But they just can't bear it. The very fact that it exists. So I think on a large scale, across the church, theologians and cardinals, that's the kind of attitude which is going on. And the more successful it is, the more annoyed they are.
Right. Yes.
So there was after COVID, a lot of people discovered the Mass, the traditional Mass, because of online masses, and priests who said the Mass, they often were very good about kind of keeping people, going spiritually, bringing them on the phone, giving outside confessions, letting people sneak into private celebrations of Mass, all a bit naughty, but actually it's for the good of souls. And so that was impressive to people as well. Yes. That some of the liberal priests, they just went, they just disappeared from the scene. They just couldn't see. Not all of them. I mean, this is not a blanket judgment, but it is just a fact that traditionally minded priests believe in the sacraments in a very traditional way. Yeah. If you're very liberal theologically, then you don't. Yeah. So for, I don't know, a Protestant, a nonconformist, one of these, United Reform people, and they would say, "Oh, Jesus is everywhere, and what difference does it make if you're in church or out of church, or what difference does it make if you're together with other people? Oh, Jesus is everywhere." So actually, that isn't the Catholic kind of understanding. Yeah, Jesus is everywhere, of course he is, but he's in the Blessed Sacrament in a very special way. He's in the priest and confession in a very special way. He's in the priest who comes to anoint you when you're dying in a very special way. And these are irreplaceable aspects of your spiritual life. And if the guys in the hazmat suits are saying, no, you can't receive communion, you can't go to confession, you can't receive the last rites, it's extremely upsetting. And the more conservative priests, they understood that.
Yes. Yes.
And so there's a kind of a whole thing now that similarly with communion on the tongue. So
yes,
the only place where you could get communion on the tongue during COVID was in traditional context. Yes. Anyway, without making too much of a thing about it, I think that after COVID, it was, the threat seemed even greater.
Yes.
And this is what we're seeing now with statistics. The church attendance in this country has collapsed. It's like it was going down before, but it's like several years of decline has been compressed into just 2 years. But that hasn't happened with traditional congregations.
Right.
They've survived. In some cases, they've grown. In some cases, they've grown a lot.
Yes.
And if the traditional Mass is a kind of really, really rubbing you up the wrong way just by existing,
yeah,
then you think Pope Francis is 84, whatever it is, and this is, and who knows who we'll get next time. I can. It's not difficult to imagine a kind of sense of, right, we've got to do it. We've got to do it now, and it doesn't matter how much pushback there is and how much non-Catholics are totally perplexed.
Yeah.
And just incomprehending about why they're doing this to themselves, these Catholics. We just got to get it done. But it's not going to work because, the traditional community is more robust.
Yes.
Than that, yeah. And I don't think they've got 10 years. If they had 10 years, they could do a lot of damage.
Yeah.
But I don't think they've got that amount of time.
No, it's really fascinating, and actually to get this kind of insight from you is so helpful for me, because I can really take this forward in my own research and my own understanding now, particularly regarding my understanding of my grandparents, because I was younger when they were alive, so I was never able to have these kind of conversations with them.
Right.
So sort of these leftover bits of documents and interviews that they did in sort of the 90s and 1970s as well. So
Right.
to get this kind of insight from you is just fantastic. So I won't take up any more of your time, but I do hope we will stay in touch. And
yes, absolutely. And if I could just mention, I have a book out.
Yes.
So a lot of what I've said in this interview is in the book, the liturgy, the family, and the crisis of modernity, which is a collection of articles and addresses and stuff I've written. So that goes into more detail. You can get that on Amazon and Latin Mass Society bookshop.
Yeah. No, and I would encourage anyone to do that, because it's such a fascinating area for Catholics and also non-Catholics as well, who as you say are maybe quite perplexed as to what's actually going on in the church. It is quite an interesting phenomenon. But anyway, so thank you, Dr. Shaw. Thank you for speaking.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck with your research.
Thank you so much, and please keep in touch. Thank you, and good evening.
Yes, good evening.
Thank you. See you later. And thank you everyone for watching as well. Okay, everyone. So as you saw there, had a really good conversation with Dr. Shaw, and he's so much information, so much insight there on what's taking place in the Catholic Church, even in this contemporary time. We're talking the last couple of years, particularly regarding the recent restrictions by Pope Francis. So it's, as I've just said to Dr. Shaw there, it's brilliant to get this insight for my research, and obviously I'm going to take this forward now and in my own writings, and hopefully you all have taken something from this that you can go forward with. So definitely check out Dr. Shaw's book, and certainly take a look at some of my writings that I've done on this. Take a look at some of my irenemary.com. I'll put that in the description below this video. That's the website that I've set up in honor of my grandparents and all the work that they did regarding the traditional mass, and the spiritual writings as well are all on there. So please go and take a look at that. And I suppose I will see you in the next episode of A Conversation with Cometan. This season 4 is just gone so quickly, and it's been a really great season, and this has been a really good way to sort of begin to wrap this season up now as we're going through some of these later episodes. So I won't take up any more of your day, but also go and check out my own website, cometan.org, as well. There's loads of information on there about my research, both about traditional Catholicism, but also all my work on Astronism and human rights and religious freedom, etc. So I'll see you in the next episode of A Conversation with Cometan, and thanks everyone for listening, and goodbye. See you, everybody.